At 11:57 on a cold Thursday night, Route 17 was still sitting at Maple Street with its doors open. Marcus Reed could feel the impatience behind him without turning around. A man in a work jacket checked his phone twice. A woman near the rear door lifted her head toward the red digital clock over the windshield. The schedule said Marcus should have pulled away 2 minutes ago. Instead, he kept one hand resting near the door control and watched the intersection through a windshield filmed with road salt. At the far light, the feeder bus finally appeared. Marcus leaned forward slightly, looking for a worn canvas grocery tote and the short gray-haired woman who usually stepped down first and hurried toward him. The feeder stopped. 3 passengers got off. None of them was Evelyn Grant. Marcus waited for a 4th person, then a 5th. The doors folded shut on the feeder, and it moved on. The shelter beside Route 17 remained empty. His radio clicked. Dana Morales, the night operations supervisor, said, "Marcus, you're still showing at Maple." "What's holding you?" Marcus looked once more at the wet sidewalk where Evelyn should have been. There was no accident in front of him, no ambulance, no drop bag, nothing dramatic enough to explain why his stomach tightened. There was only an empty patch of concrete where, night after night, one person had always appeared. Several weeks earlier, Marcus had not even known her name. The first time Marcus waited for Evelyn, he did not think of it as waiting. Route 17 was scheduled to leave Maple Street at 11:55 p.m., and the feeder was supposed to arrive at 11:52. On paper, 3 minutes looked generous. In practice, the feeder had to crawl through an evening construction bottleneck several miles back, and Marcus had already noticed it arriving closer to 11:54 most nights. That evening, he had checked his mirror, reached for the door control, and seen headlights turning the corner. The feeder stopped across the intersection just as his clock changed to 11:55. An elderly woman stepped down carrying a faded canvas grocery tote. She looked at Marcus's bus, looked at the signal, and began moving faster without quite running. Marcus could have closed the doors. Nobody would have questioned it. Instead, he watched the crosswalk count down, held the bus for less than a minute, and lowered the front step when she reached the curb. She climbed aboard, breathing hard, and pressed her fare card to the reader. "Thank you," she said, still catching her breath. Marcus gave a small nod. "You're good." She moved to a seat just behind the front wheel well and placed the tote between her shoes. That was all. He did not ask where she had come from or why she was traveling alone so late. At the transit center, he arrived less than a minute behind schedule and forgot about it before the end of his shift. 2 nights later, the feeder was late again. The same woman appeared at the same corner with the same canvas tote. Marcus's hand was already off the door switch before he consciously decided to wait. By the following week, Marcus recognized the rhythm. At 11:54, he would check the signal. If the feeder's lights appeared beyond the pharmacy, he would leave the doors open. If it was nowhere in sight, he would tell himself he was leaving at 11:55 exactly. He did not always keep that promise. One Tuesday, the feeder did not reach Maple Street until almost 11:57. Evelyn came across the intersection with her tote pressed against her hip, apologizing before both feet were on the bus. She tapped her reduced fare card. The reader flashed red. She tried again, more carefully, and it flashed red a second time. Marcus saw her shoulders tighten as the passengers behind her waited. "Give it one more try," he said, keeping his voice ordinary. "Those readers get stubborn when it's cold. On the 3rd tap, the screen turned green." Evelyn exhaled and gave him a look that was half relief, half embarrassment. "I swear there's money on it," Marcus said. "It took it. You're fine." He pulled away before the moment could become larger than it needed to be. After that, she began greeting him with a quiet, "Evening, Marcus," having read his name from the small identification placard near the driver's area. He learned hers because one night she thanked him and added, "I'm Evelyn, by the way." "You keep rescuing me from that corner," Marcus answered. "I'm not rescuing anybody. I'm waiting at a red light half the time." It was not entirely true, and both of them seemed to know it. The next night, when the light was green and the feeder was still a block away, Marcus waited anyway. Rain made the routine more noticeable. On wet nights, the construction traffic slowed further, and Marcus began watching for the feeder before he checked his own departure clock. One evening, Evelyn boarded, carrying a small metal thermos in addition to the canvas tote. She had barely taken her seat when the bus turned and the thermos rolled forward, bumping against the base of Marcus's console. Its lid had loosened. Coffee seeped across the rubber floor in a narrow brown line. Marcus pulled into the next safe stop and reached for the paper towels kept beside his seat. Before he could stand, Evelyn was already beside him with a handful of napkins from her tote. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought I tightened that thing." Marcus took 2 napkins and blocked the coffee before it reached the pedals. "It's not near anything important. Sit down before I make this worse by having you clean my bus while it's moving." Evelyn smiled and returned to her seat. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but after that Marcus noticed details he had not paid attention to before. Evelyn always folded her transfer slip and tucked it into the outer pocket of her wallet. She often carried one small food container home. She never asked him to wait, even when she could see he was waiting. And whenever the feeder was late, she looked at the clock above his windshield before she looked at him. Marcus began checking the intersection almost automatically. Sometimes he told himself he was watching traffic. Sometimes he knew better. The decision was becoming a habit before either of them had called it one. Marcus learned why Evelyn made the trip only because the subject came up on its own. One night she boarded later than usual with a plastic container that smelled faintly of baked chicken and onions. The feeder had been delayed almost 4 minutes, and Marcus was already pulling away when she said from her usual seat, "My grandson decided tonight was the night he needed help building a cardboard volcano." Marcus glanced at her in the mirror. "At 11 o'clock? Evelyn gave a tired laugh. "Apparently, lava has deadlines." She explained that her daughter Denise worked an evening inventory shift at a distribution warehouse. Evelyn went across town 5 nights a week to stay with Denise's 2 children until Denise got home around 11. Once Denise walked through the door, Evelyn packed whatever leftovers were offered, hurried to the feeder, and tried to make the final Route 17 connection at Maple Street. "5 nights?" Marcus asked. Evelyn nodded. "Most weeks." That answer changed the calculation in his head. Until then, he had imagined an occasional late visit, something that could be solved by leaving 10 minutes earlier. Now he understood that the narrow transfer was built into her week. If she missed his bus, there was no later Route 17 that night. Marcus did not ask what she did when that happened. He did not want the answer to become a reason he could no longer pretend the extra minutes were casual. At the next stop, Evelyn lifted the food container slightly and said, "Tonight's payment for volcano duty." Marcus smiled. "Sounds expensive," she answered. "You haven't seen the glue on my coat." Then the bus moved on, carrying them toward the same end of town on a timetable that assumed 3 minutes were always 3 minutes. The first cost Marcus could measure was not a reprimand. It was his break. Route 17 reached the transit center before Marcus's final loop, and on a good night he had just enough time to park in the assigned bay, use the restroom, walk once around the bus, drink whatever was left of his coffee, and check his phone. Tessa, his 19-year-old daughter, knew that window. She worked early mornings at a bakery and attended community college, so their schedules missed each other more often than they met. Her messages were usually short, "You on break?" or "Call if you have 5. One Wednesday, the feeder reached Maple Street at 11:58. Marcus held Route 17 because he could see Evelyn coming across the intersection. By the time she boarded, they were 3 minutes down. Traffic took another 2. At the transit center, Marcus had only enough time to secure the bus, hurry inside, wash his hands, and return for the required walk-around. His phone vibrated while he checked the rear lights. Tessa had written, "You free for a minute?" Marcus saw the message, looked at the departure clock, and slid the phone back into his pocket. He told himself he would answer after the final loop. By then it was after 1 in the morning, and Tessa had to be up before 5. He sent, "Sorry," Shift got tight. Tomorrow? The message showed delivered but not read. Marcus sat behind the wheel with cold coffee beside him and knew exactly where those missing minutes had gone. No single weight felt serious. Added together, they were beginning to belong to somebody else. Evelyn noticed the strain before Marcus admitted it. A few nights later, the feeder was again late enough that Route 17 should have been gone. Marcus waited because he could see its headlights turning onto Maple Street. Evelyn boarded, tapped her card successfully on the first try, and did not move toward her usual seat. She stood near the yellow line with one hand gripping the top of her tote. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" He looked at her in the mirror. "Sure." She glanced toward the clock. "Am I making you late?" It was the simplest version of the question, and for that reason Marcus found it hard to answer. He could have said yes. He could have explained that his next break was shrinking, that the operations system recorded every arrival, that the people behind her had schedules of their own. Instead, he looked toward the road and said, "The schedule's making me late." "Not you?" Evelyn studied him for another second. "That's a very bus driver answer," Marcus smiled. "I've had practice." She finally sat down. The answer seemed to ease something in her, but it also closed the conversation too neatly. Marcus had turned a recurring decision into a problem with a printed timetable, something neither of them had to own. Evelyn did not have to ask whether he should keep waiting. Marcus did not have to decide whether kindness changed when it became expected. The next evening, at 11:55, the feeder was not yet at the intersection. Marcus looked at the clock, then at the headlights approaching in the distance, and kept the doors open. Dana Morales raised the issue at the transit center before Marcus could pretend the pattern was invisible. She was standing beside his bay with a clipboard when Route 17 arrived late for the third time that week. Dana supervised several night routes, and she had a habit of speaking to drivers face-to-face when she could instead of turning every problem into a radio exchange. She waited until the last passenger stepped off, then held up a printed on-time report. "You're drifting on the same section," she said. "Maple Street, mostly." "What's happening?" Marcus shut down the bus and reached for the paper cup beside his seat. The coffee was cold again. "Connection issue." Dana looked at the report. "With which route?" "The feeder from the east side. Construction keeps pushing it past the window." Dana nodded once. She knew the bottleneck. "Are you holding for it?" Marcus paused long enough to make the answer obvious. "If I can see it coming." Dana did not lecture him. She only said, "A minute here becomes a late pull out there. Then another rider misses something 2 stops later. Just keep that in mind." Marcus said he would. 2 days later, another notice appeared in his operator mailbox. Late running, repeated deviation, review if pattern continued. He folded the page once and slid it into his jacket pocket beside the small notebook where he recorded unusual service problems after his shifts. On the drive home, he thought about Tessa's unanswered message, Dana's report, and Evelyn standing by the yellow line asking whether she was making him late. The following afternoon, when Marcus reported for another night shift, the notice was still in his pocket. So was the question. And when he pictured Maple Street at 11:55, he already knew he would look for the feeder before he closed the doors. The next week, Marcus found one of Evelyn's gloves under the seat behind the front wheel well. It was dark brown wool, worn thin at the fingertips, and at first he almost missed it during his final walkthrough because it had slid against the wall beneath the heater vent. He picked it up, turned it over once, and immediately knew whose it was. Evelyn wore the pair most cold nights, usually pulling one off with her teeth when she reached for her fare card. For a second, Marcus considered setting it beside his coffee cup so he could hand it back himself the next evening. Instead, he carried it into the transit center, filled out the lost item tag, wrote Route 17 and the date, and placed it in the overnight bin. He knew the difference between recognizing a passenger and turning familiarity into something outside the job. The next night, Evelyn boarded with one bare hand tucked into her coat pocket. After her card cleared, Marcus told her the lost and found desk had a glove from his bus. Evelyn stopped. "Brown wool?" Marcus nodded. "Should be there under your name once they log it." She smiled with visible relief. "I thought I had dropped it on the sidewalk," Marcus said. "You got lucky." Evelyn looked toward the small service counter at the transit center on the far end of the route and said she would collect it when they arrived. She did not thank him as though he had personally rescued the glove, and Marcus did not tell her he had recognized it immediately. That restraint made the exchange feel more comfortable, not less. Later, when she stepped off at the transit center long enough to collect it and reboard for the final stretch, she held up the recovered glove and said, "Official channels." "Very impressive." Marcus answered, "We have a system for a reason." Evelyn pulled the glove on and looked toward the clock above the windshield. Maybe some systems work better than others. Marcus knew she meant the transfer, but he let the remark pass. At Maple Street the following night, he still checked the feeder before closing his doors. At Denise's apartment, Evelyn's late trips looked less like errands and more like a second shift. She usually arrived before dinner, hung her coat over the back of a kitchen chair, and set her canvas tote beside the refrigerator. Denise left for the warehouse with her hair still damp from a rushed shower and a travel mug in one hand. The children were old enough to handle most things themselves, but still young enough to need someone to notice when homework was not actually finished. One evening, Evelyn browned ground turkey in a skillet, added a jar of tomato sauce, and listened while her grandson tried to explain why a worksheet had disappeared from his backpack. Her granddaughter sat at the table with spelling words spread across 3 index cards and kept asking whether Wednesday had 2 Ds. Evelyn corrected the worksheet story, checked the spelling list, packed leftovers into containers, and looked at the kitchen clock more often as 11 approached. Denise was supposed to be home around 11, but inventory counts ran long when trucks arrived late. At 10:53, Denise texted that she was still waiting for a supervisor to release the aisle. Evelyn read the message, placed her phone face down, and began putting on her coat anyway. Her granddaughter asked why she was leaving before Mom got home. Evelyn said she was not leaving yet, only getting ready. At 11:02, Denise finally opened the apartment door with her warehouse badge still clipped to her shirt. She apologized before she had both shoes off. Evelyn handed her the container of leftover pasta, reminded the children where their signed school papers were, and moved toward the door. Denise told her she could wait 5 minutes and catch her breath. Evelyn shook her head. 5 minutes is the whole problem. She said it lightly, but her hands were already searching the tote for her bus card. Denise offered to drive her to Maple Street, then looked toward the children and stopped herself. Evelyn said she would be fine. She hurried down the stairs, crossed 2 blocks to the feeder stop, and spent the ride watching the digital clock over the front windshield. The narrow transfer was not caused by carelessness. It was the final link in a chain of dinner, homework, Denise's release time, traffic, and one timetable that allowed almost no room for any of them to run late. The money between Evelyn and Denise was handled the same way as the late buses, quietly, in amounts small enough to pretend they were temporary. One Thursday, Denise came into the kitchen after work and saw Evelyn slide folded bills beneath a utility notice held to the refrigerator by a red magnet. Denise stopped with one hand still on her lunch bag. "Mom," Evelyn did not turn around immediately. She was rinsing 2 plastic containers at the sink. Denise pulled the cash free and counted it with her thumb. "You can't keep doing this." Evelyn dried her hands on a dish towel. "It's just for this month." Denise gave her a tired look. "You said that last month." Evelyn reached for the children's lunch containers instead of the money. She asked whether her grandson was still refusing sandwiches with mustard and whether her granddaughter needed lunch money for Friday. Denise did not let her change the subject completely. She said the evening shift differential was supposed to help them catch up, not turn her mother into part of the budget. Evelyn replied that she was only smoothing out a rough patch. Denise said she had heard that phrase before. For a moment, neither woman moved. The refrigerator compressor came on behind the bills. Then Evelyn opened a drawer, found 2 sandwich bags, and asked whether there were apples left. Denise exhaled and put the folded cash back beneath the magnet, not because the argument was resolved, but because the children were in the next room and she did not have the energy to fight before midnight. Evelyn packed 2 lunches, checked the time, and zipped her tote. Nothing in the exchange looked dramatic. No one was facing eviction that night. No collection agency was pounding on the door. But Denise's better-paid evening hours, Evelyn's childcare, the utility shortfall, and the last feeder to Maple Street were beginning to depend on one another. Evelyn treated each piece as separate because seeing them as one arrangement would have meant admitting how much of her week was holding the arrangement together. Marcus had his own version of a temporary arrangement. Tessa asked about Saturday breakfast on a Thursday afternoon, before his shift began. She sent a voice message while he was tying his work shoes in the kitchen. "Dad, we have moved breakfast twice. If you're going to be asleep, just tell me now." Marcus listened again before answering. He told her 8:30, the same diner they usually used on weekends, and promised he would set 2 alarms. Tessa replied with a single thumbs up. That night, the feeder reached Maple Street late. Marcus held Route 17 for Evelyn. The delay reduced his transit center recovery time to almost nothing. He used the restroom, walked the bus, skipped the coffee refill, and pulled out again. On Friday night, the same thing happened with an added traffic backup near the construction zone. By the time Marcus clocked out after 1 in the morning, his shoulders ached from holding them tense all shift. He drove home, put his phone on the dresser, set 2 alarms, and lay down without changing out of his undershirt. The first alarm sounded at 7:15. Marcus silenced it without fully waking. The second alarm sounded at 7:45. He reached for the phone, knocked it onto the floor, and slept through the vibration. At 9:23, he woke to sunlight against the curtains and 3 messages from Tessa. The first said she was leaving home. The second said she had a table. The third said, "I'm heading to work. We can try another day." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in his hand. He typed an apology, erased it, then called. Tessa did not answer because she was already at the bakery. He sent, "I messed up. I'm sorry." Her reply came nearly an hour later. "I know you work nights. I just need you to stop promising the mornings if you can't do them." Marcus stared at that sentence longer than he expected. He had been telling himself the missed calls and missed breakfasts were simply what night work cost. That explanation was not false. It was incomplete. Some of the exhaustion came from the job he was scheduled to do. Some came from minutes he had chosen to give away without telling anyone at home that the choice existed. The next consequence came from a passenger Marcus barely knew. It happened on a clear Tuesday when the feeder was late enough that Marcus held Route 17 almost 3 minutes. Evelyn boarded, thanked him with a quick nod, and sat down. 2 stops later, a woman in Navy medical scrubs moved toward the front before her stop and asked Marcus whether Route 22 usually waited at Central Avenue if Route 17 was late. Marcus knew the answer before he gave it. Not usually. The woman looked at the clock and said, "I figured. I have about 4 minutes if we're on time." Her voice was not accusing. That made it harder to dismiss. Marcus told her he would do what he could without driving unsafely. She said, "I know. I'm not blaming you. I just don't want to spend an hour waiting for the next one." When she stepped off, Marcus watched her hurry toward the cross street. Route 17 was still running behind. Evelyn had heard the exchange. She sat very still with both hands resting on her tote. At Central Avenue, the Route 22 taillights disappeared through the intersection just before Marcus reached the stop. The woman in scrubs stood under the shelter and looked back at his bus as it pulled in. Marcus opened the doors, but there was nothing he could offer her that would change the connection she had just lost. He had waited at Maple Street to keep one person's night from stretching another hour. Now another person's night had stretched instead. The 2 situations were not perfectly equal. He knew that. Evelyn had no later Route 17 at all, while Route 22 would eventually return. Still, the difference did not erase the transfer of inconvenience. For the rest of the loop, Marcus kept thinking about Dana's earlier warning that a minute in one place became something else farther down the line. At Maple Street the next night, his hand still hovered near the door control when the feeder had not appeared. The difference was that now he could picture the woman in scrubs at Central Avenue, too. Dana stopped treating the pattern as an informal conversation the following night. Marcus pulled into the transit center and found her waiting beside the bay with several printed reports clipped together. She did not begin with the word warning. She began with numbers. She showed him his Maple Street departure times, the late arrivals at Central Avenue, the shortened recovery periods, and 2 occasions when his final loop started behind schedule. Marcus looked at the pages and said the feeder connection was badly designed. Dana agreed. She pointed to the scheduled arrival of 11:52 and Route 17's departure at 11:55. Then she pointed to the actual feeder arrivals Marcus had been seeing. "I understand the problem," she said. "Understanding it does not give you authority to build a new schedule one night at a time." Marcus told her he was usually holding only when he could see the feeder. Dana answered that riders could not know which driver would wait, which driver would not, or how long the wait might be. She also reminded him that shortened recovery time was not just a paperwork issue. A driver who repeatedly gave up brakes was still responsible for staying alert through the final loop. Marcus said, "So I'm supposed to shut the doors with someone running across the intersection?" Dana did not answer immediately. She looked at him, then at the report. "You're supposed to operate the route you're assigned. If there is a connection failure, document it. Give me the actual feeder times. We can push the issue through service planning, but you cannot make a standing exception by yourself." She handed him a formal notice stating that continued unauthorized holds could affect his assignment. Dana did not threaten to fire him. She did not pretend the schedule was working. She simply made the boundary official. Marcus folded the notice and slid it into his jacket pocket beside the earlier one. He asked whether service planning would change anything quickly. Dana said she could not promise that, but a documented problem can be reviewed. A private workaround disappears the minute you're not driving. Marcus disliked how reasonable that sounded. Reasonable did not make Maple Street easier at 11:55. Evelyn arrived earlier than usual the next evening. Denise had been released on time. The feeder made the construction corridor without stopping, and Evelyn stepped onto the transit center platform several minutes before Marcus's departure. Route 17 was parked in its bay with the doors open. Marcus stood outside near the front corner of the bus. Dana was beside him with the same clipboard she had carried the night before. Evelyn slowed as she approached. She was still far enough away that neither of them looked toward her. Dana was speaking in a low voice, but the platform was mostly empty and the concrete canopy carried sound. Evelyn heard Dana say that the notice was formal and that another pattern of unauthorized holds could affect Marcus's route assignment. Marcus answered that he understood. Dana said she was not asking him to ignore missed connections. She was asking him to report them instead of fixing them on his own. Evelyn stopped beside a bench and adjusted the strap of her canvas tote even though it was not slipping. She did not hear the entire conversation. She did not hear what Marcus had said the night before about watching someone run toward a closing bus. She heard enough. When Dana walked away, Marcus climbed back behind the wheel and began checking the dashboard. Evelyn waited several seconds before boarding. She tapped her card, and Marcus greeted her the same way he always did. "You're early tonight." Evelyn looked toward the clock above the windshield. For once. She sat behind the front wheel well and took off her gloves one finger at a time. Marcus noticed she was quieter than usual, but assumed she was tired. At Maple Street later that week, he would remember nothing unusual about that ride except how early she had been. Evelyn, however, spent most of it looking at the back of his seat, then at the schedule card posted inside the bus, then back at the clock. She had asked him once whether she was making him late. Now she knew the answer involved more than minutes. Over the next several nights, Evelyn began changing small things. She arrived at Denise's apartment with dinner already partly prepared, so less work would remain after the children ate. She checked homework earlier. At 10:45, she started putting on her coat even when Denise had not yet texted that she was leaving the warehouse. One evening, Denise came through the door at 10:58 and offered to make tea before Evelyn went. Evelyn refused before Denise finished asking, "Not tonight. I want to catch the feeder clean." Denise looked at her. "Since when do you call a bus connection clean?" Evelyn smiled, but she was already fastening her coat. Another night, Denise tried to hand her a leftover container, and Evelyn nearly left without it because she was watching the time. Her granddaughter had to call her back from the hallway. On the feeder, Evelyn sat closer to the front and watched every traffic light. At Maple Street, she sometimes reached Route 17 before 11:55 and looked relieved in a way Marcus could not quite understand. He assumed she was trying to make the connection easier on him after their earlier conversation. He did not know what she had overheard at the transit center, and she did not tell him. The change might have continued quietly if the weather had remained ordinary. Instead, at the end of the week, a severe storm warning appeared on the bulletin board near the operator room. The forecast called for heavy rain, strong wind, and possible street flooding during the late shift. Marcus read it while filling his paper cup with coffee. That night, Evelyn boarded after another close transfer and stood beside the fare box longer than usual. She looked at him, then at the rain beginning to mark the windshield. "If that feeder is late tomorrow night," she asked, "will you leave?" Marcus kept his eyes on the road ahead. Her tone was different from the earlier question about making him late. This time, she was not asking whether the schedule was fair. She was asking what he would do. Marcus rested one hand on the wheel and said, "I'll deal with tomorrow night when it comes." Evelyn nodded once and took her usual seat. Neither of them said anything else about the forecast. The storm reached the city before Marcus finished his first loop. Rain struck the windshield hard enough that the wipers never seemed to clear more than a narrow moving window, and gusts pushed loose branches into the gutters. Dispatch messages appeared one after another on the console. Delay on the East Corridor, standing water near the underpass, detour possible if the creek rose another 6 inches. Marcus drove slower than the timetable allowed because everyone else was doing the same thing. Brake lights stretched through intersections. Cars hesitated at flooded curbs. By 10:30, Route 17 was already several minutes behind. At the transit center, Dana moved between buses with a radio in one hand and a stack of route notices tucked beneath her rain jacket. She told drivers to use judgment around standing water and reminded them that recovery times would be compressed. Marcus looked at the clock, then at the weather warning still posted near the operator room. He thought about Evelyn's question from the night before. If the feeder was late, would he leave? He had answered that he would deal with the night when it came. Now the night had come, and nothing about it was simple. Near Maple Street, water had gathered along the curb beside the shelter and was deep enough that Marcus pulled a little farther forward than usual before stopping. The pharmacy across the intersection was dark. The traffic signal swung slightly in the wind. Marcus checked the clock. He was already late himself. That should have made the decision easier. Instead, he looked east toward the road where the feeder normally appeared and waited for headlights through the rain. Marcus reached Maple Street after 11:55, so by the printed schedule there was nothing left to hold. Route 17 was late, the feeder was later, and the storm had turned the usual 3-minute transfer into something meaningless. A few passengers shifted in their seats while rain rattled against the roof. Marcus kept the doors open and watched the intersection. At 11:58, the feeder's headlights finally appeared beyond the construction turn. Marcus felt his shoulders loosen for the first time in several minutes. He expected to see Evelyn near the front door before the bus even stopped. The feeder pulled to the curb across the intersection. One man stepped off carrying a plastic grocery bag over his head. A younger woman followed with her coat pulled tight around her neck. Then another passenger. Marcus leaned forward. The feeder doors stayed open for several seconds, then folded shut. No gray-haired woman with a canvas tote appeared. No one waited at the crosswalk. Evelyn's usual place beneath the Maple Street shelter was empty, except for rain blowing across the bench. Marcus watched the feeder move away and told himself she might have missed it near Denise's apartment. That was possible. Denise might have been released late. Evelyn might have decided not to travel in the storm. Any of those explanations made sense. What did not make sense was the way Marcus kept looking at the shelter after the feeder was gone. Evelyn had been asking about the transfer all week. She had been leaving Denise's place earlier, sitting closer to the front, watching every light. The empty shelter did not prove anything had happened. It only broke a pattern Marcus had learned well enough to feel when one piece was missing. Marcus stayed at Maple Street longer than he had on any ordinary night. First 30 seconds, then another minute. He checked the mirror, the crosswalk, the feeder stop across the intersection. A passenger near the middle of the bus asked whether they were waiting for someone. Marcus answered that he was checking a connection. The man did not argue, but he looked at his phone and leaned back with a tired breath. Another passenger pulled the cord even though they had not moved yet, then laughed quietly at herself and released it. Marcus could feel the delay becoming something shared by everyone behind him. His radio clicked. Dana's voice came through more sharply than usual because the channel was crowded with storm reports. She asked why Route 17 was still holding at Maple Street. Marcus told her the feeder had arrived, but one regular connection had not appeared. Dana asked whether there was any reported incident at the stop. Marcus said no. She told him to continue. Marcus hesitated and looked once more toward the shelter. Dana repeated the instruction, this time adding that several streets farther west were already backing up because of standing water and that another unscheduled hold would make the last loop harder to operate safely. Marcus knew she was right. He also knew that if Evelyn came around the corner 30 seconds after he left, there would be no later Route 17. His hand rested on the door control. For one moment, the entire problem was reduced to a button beneath his fingers. Then, he closed the doors. The bus pulled away from Maple Street with rain sweeping across the windshield. Marcus checked the right mirror until the shelter disappeared behind him. No one came running. Marcus completed the route because there was nothing else he could responsibly do. He slowed through flooded intersections, waited for pedestrians who were almost invisible behind umbrellas, and kept both hands on the wheel whenever the wind hit the side of the bus. Yet part of his attention remained at Maple Street. He did not imagine an ambulance or a fall or some hidden disaster. There was no evidence for any of that. What bothered him was smaller and harder to dismiss. Evelyn was consistent. She folded her transfer slip into the same wallet pocket. She sat behind the front wheel well. She carried leftovers home more often than not. When the feeder was close, she hurried. When she thought she might make Marcus late, she asked about it instead of pretending not to notice. Most of all, after she had begun arriving earlier, she had asked him directly whether he would leave if the feeder was late during the storm. Marcus had treated the question as something that belonged to tomorrow. Now, he wondered why she had needed an answer so badly. At Central Avenue, he saw the empty shelter where the woman in medical scrubs had once missed Route 22 because of his delay. The memory landed differently tonight. He had spent weeks deciding, minute by minute, whose inconvenience mattered more. Evelyn had apparently been doing her own version of the same calculation. Marcus finished the last passenger portion of the loop and drove toward the transit center. He did not speed. He did not call Denise while driving. He did not leave his assigned route. He simply decided that once the bus was secure, he would ask a question he should probably have asked earlier, whether anyone actually knew where Evelyn had gone. At the transit center, Marcus parked Route 17 in the assigned bay, set the brake, completed the required shutdown checks, and found Dana near the dispatcher desk. Water dripped from the shoulders of her jacket onto the floor. Marcus asked whether there had been any incident involving the East Side feeder. Dana looked at him for a second, then turned to the operations screen. She checked the route log, the storm incident list, and the messages that had come in from drivers. There had been no collision involving the feeder, no passenger medical call, and no emergency reported at Maple Street. The bus itself had completed its run. Marcus felt some of the pressure in his chest, ease, but not enough. He asked whether the feeder driver was still out. Dana said the vehicle was due back shortly. Then she looked at Marcus and said, "You are not going back out in a bus to look for anybody." Marcus answered, "I know." Dana's expression softened slightly. She told him that if he wanted to ask the driver what happened, he could wait until both operators were off the road and the feeder was secured. Marcus went through his post-trip inspection, turned in the first set of paperwork, and stood under the covered loading area while rain blew sideways beyond the concrete columns. Nearly 20 minutes later, the feeder pulled into its bay. Its driver finished unloading, checked the interior, and came inside carrying a soaked cap in one hand. Marcus introduced himself, even though they had passed each other on the route dozens of times. He described Evelyn without giving more information than necessary. Older woman, gray hair, canvas tote, usually transferring at Maple Street. The driver recognized her before Marcus finished. "Yeah," he said. "She was on my bus tonight, but she didn't ride all the way to Maple." The feeder driver remembered Evelyn because she had asked an unusual question shortly after boarding. She wanted to know whether anything near Maple Street stayed open until the first morning buses. At first he thought she was asking because of the storm. Then, when dispatch sent a service update saying Route 17 was already running several minutes late and traffic near Maple Street was backing up, Evelyn asked him whether there was an earlier stop near the all-night diner 2 blocks off the transfer corridor. The driver told her there was one about 2 stops before Maple Street. She said she knew the place, he told Marcus. Said she could wait inside until morning if she needed to. Marcus asked whether she seemed confused. The driver shook his head immediately. "No, not at all. She knew where she was going. She asked me to call the stop before it came because the windows were fogged up." He remembered her getting off carefully with the canvas tote tucked beneath her coat. She had thanked him and walked toward the diner entrance beneath an awning. Marcus knew the diner. He passed it on some deadhead trips and had seen its lights burning long after everything else on the block closed. The clue made the night less frightening but more troubling. Evelyn had not simply missed the transfer. She had planned around missing it. Marcus asked what time she got off. The driver told him. By then, Evelyn would have known Route 17 had not yet reached Maple Street. She had chosen not to go there anyway. Dana, who had been listening from the desk, told Marcus to finish clocking out before he did anything else. He completed the remaining paperwork, returned the bus keys, and changed out of his wet outer jacket. Only after his shift was over did he take his own car toward the diner. The diner was still open when Marcus arrived. Rainwater ran along the curb in shallow streams, and only 4 cars were parked outside. Through the front windows, he could see a server wiping the counter and a television over the register showing a weather map with red bands moving across the county. Marcus stepped inside and found Evelyn in a booth near the back wall. Her canvas tote sat on the floor beside her feet, darkened by rain along the bottom. A cup of coffee rested in front of her with the surface gone flat and untouched. Evelyn looked up, saw Marcus, and for the first time since he had known her, seemed genuinely caught off guard. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Marcus slid into the opposite side of the booth, but kept his coat on. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Evelyn looked toward the window. She said she had planned to stay until morning service started. The diner was warm, open all night, and safer than standing at Maple Street in the storm. Marcus asked why she had not tried the transfer. Evelyn rubbed one thumb along the rim of the coffee cup. "Because I knew you'd wait." Marcus said Route 17 had already been late. She answered, "That's exactly why." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The server passed by and asked whether Marcus wanted coffee. He said no. Evelyn finally picked up her cup but did not drink. She told him she had known the storm would make the feeder late. She had also known that if she appeared at Maple Street, Marcus would have to choose again between the schedule and her. So she had removed herself from the choice. Marcus looked at the wet tote beside her. "By sitting here until 5 in the morning?" Evelyn answered quietly. "That was my problem to solve." Marcus asked Evelyn when she had decided that waiting in a diner all night was the better option. She did not answer immediately. She straightened the paper sleeve around her coffee cup, then admitted that she had overheard Dana talking to him at the transit center. "Not every word," she said. "Enough." She had heard that another pattern of unauthorized holds could affect his assignment. Marcus looked down at the table. Evelyn said she had spent the following nights trying to reach the feeder earlier. She had skipped tea at Denise's, packed up faster, watched every clock, and told herself that if she could make the transfer cleanly, nothing else had to change. The storm made that impossible. "Denise needs those evening hours," she said. "And you need your job. I don't get to make either of those things harder because my bus is late." Marcus told her she was not the one who designed the timetable. Evelyn answered that he had been the one paying for it with his break in his record. Marcus started to say that he chose to wait, then stopped. That was true, but it was also the problem. He had chosen privately, night after night, until Evelyn had begun treating his choice like something she owed him for. She had responded by hiding her own costs just as carefully. Marcus thought about Tessa's missed calls, Denise's late shifts, the woman in scrubs at Central Avenue, and Dana's reports. Nobody had agreed to one arrangement. They had simply kept absorbing whatever piece landed closest to them. He asked Evelyn whether Denise knew she planned to stay at the diner until morning. Evelyn's eyes dropped to the coffee. No. Marcus asked whether Denise thought she was already on Route 17. Evelyn did not answer, which was answer enough. Marcus placed his phone on the table. "Then we call her." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. Marcus asked again, to be sure. She said, "All right." He called Denise with Evelyn's permission. Denise answered on the second ring. Marcus identified himself as the Route 17 driver her mother knew. Before he could explain further, Denise said, confused, "I thought she was already on the bus home." Denise arrived at the diner 25 minutes after Marcus called. A neighbor from the apartment downstairs had agreed to sit with the sleeping children until she returned. Denise came through the door with rain on her coat and went straight to Evelyn's booth. She did not raise her voice. That made the hurt in it easier to hear. "You were going to sit here until morning and not tell me?" Evelyn looked at the untouched coffee. She said Denise had already worked a full shift and still had the children to get up for school. Denise pulled off her wet coat and sat beside her mother instead of across from her. That is not an answer. Evelyn finally admitted that she had been afraid of forcing Denise to give up the better-paid evening hours. The extra money mattered. The utility bills had been tight. The children needed someone dependable. Evelyn had convinced herself that one uncomfortable night in a diner was cheaper than disturbing everything else. Denise stared at her. Cheaper for who? Evelyn did not have an immediate reply. Marcus stayed at the end of the booth and let the silence belong to them. Denise said she had assumed the arrangement was working because her mother kept saying it was working. Evelyn answered that Denise had enough to worry about already. Denise shook her head. "You don't get to decide what I can afford to know." Evelyn's face tightened, not with anger so much as recognition. She said she had not wanted Denise to lose hours because of her. Denise answered that losing some hours might be a cost they had to discuss, but spending a stormy night alone downtown was also a cost, and hiding it did not make it disappear. No one solved the childcare problem in that booth. Denise still needed the income. Evelyn still wanted to help. Marcus still had a formal warning in his pocket. But by the time Denise stood to take her mother home, one thing had changed. The arrangement could no longer survive by letting each person privately absorb the part that embarrassed them most. On his next shift, Marcus arrived early enough to sit in the operator room before pulling Route 17 out of the yard. He took the small notebook from his jacket and went through several weeks of entries he had originally made for himself. Feeder at 11:54, feeder at 11:57, construction backup, held 2 minutes, no hold, missed connection visible at light. None of it looked important, one line at a time. Together it showed a pattern more clearly than his explanations ever had. At the transit center, Marcus handed the notebook to Dana and told her he wanted the transfer problem documented properly. Dana read several pages, then asked him to copy the relevant dates onto a service gap form so the original notebook remained with him. She did not tear up his warning. She did not say the storm proved he had been right all along. Instead, she told him that the unauthorized holds were still unauthorized and that the notice would remain in his record. Marcus nodded. He had expected that. Dana helped him list the scheduled feeder arrival, the actual arrival times he had observed, the Route 17 departure requirement, and the fact that there was no later Route 17 after the connection. She said she would forward the request for service planning review, but she could not promise when or whether the schedule would change. Then she made the operating rule just as clear as before. Until something official changed, Marcus was not to create a standing hold at Maple Street. If the feeder missed the connection, he was to record it and continue the route. Marcus looked through the glass toward his bus. "That is going to feel terrible some nights." Dana said, "I know." She did not offer him a cleaner answer. When Marcus left the office, the problem had become visible on paper for the first time, but visibility was not the same thing as repair. The next time he reached Maple Street, he would still have to decide whether he could live with following the rule he had asked the system to acknowledge. Denise and Evelyn changed their week in pieces, because there was no version that solved everything at once. Denise spoke with a coworker who also struggled with evening childcare, and they arranged 2 nights when one would cover the other's children before their shifts overlapped. It was awkward, dependent on both women keeping their schedules, and not something Denise could use every night. She also gave up some of the premium evening hours that had made the warehouse shift worth fighting to keep. The difference appeared quickly in her paycheck. Denise did not pretend otherwise. Evelyn still came to the apartment several evenings, but not 5. On the night she stayed home, Denise had to plan meals earlier, trade favors more carefully, and sometimes accept fewer paid hours. The refrigerator still carried utility notices beneath the red magnet. What changed was the money tucked behind them. One evening, Evelyn reached into her purse with folded cash, then stopped when Denise looked at her. Denise said, "If I need help, I will ask you." Evelyn answered, "And if I can help, I get to say yes." Denise agreed. Then she added, "But it doesn't get hidden under the electric bill anymore." Evelyn put the money back into her purse. Neither woman smiled. The agreement was useful precisely because it was not sentimental. They were replacing assumption with an uncomfortable conversation they would probably have to repeat. Evelyn's fewer childcare nights gave her several evenings at home, but they also cost Denise money and required other people to take on small pieces of the schedule. The burden did not disappear. It moved into places where the people carrying it could see one another. On one of Evelyn's remaining nights, she still checked the clock before leaving Denise's apartment. But she no longer treated every late minute as something she had to hide from her daughter or solve by herself. Marcus had a similar conversation with Tessa, though it took him longer to begin it. He called her before one of his shifts and asked whether Saturday breakfast was still possible. Tessa said yes, then added that she did not want another promise made out of guilt. Marcus told her that was fair. He said something he had avoided saying before. Some of the missed calls and lost sleep had come from ordinary night work, but some had come from decisions he made on the route. He had been holding a final connection for a regular passenger because the printed transfer barely worked. He had kept telling Tessa that the shift was simply tight because admitting he was choosing to give away part of his break sounded harder to explain. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would have understood why you did it. I just wanted to know you were doing it." Marcus rubbed his thumb across the edge of his phone. "I know that now." They did not turn the conversation into a larger confession about his divorce, her childhood, or every missed morning between them. They picked one breakfast. Saturday at 8:30, Marcus finished his Friday shift tired, went home, set 2 alarms, and put the phone across the room so he would have to stand to silence them. He arrived at the diner a few minutes early with tired eyes and a clean work jacket folded over one arm. Tessa came in carrying the smell of bread from the bakery. Their conversation was ordinary. She complained about a class assignment. Marcus complained that the coffee was weaker than it used to be. They split a plate of toast. Neither of them had ordered correctly. Nothing about the breakfast repaired every absence. It did something smaller. Marcus had named the choice before asking Tessa to absorb its consequences, and then he kept the time they had agreed to protect.
The timetable at Maple Street showed a connection that almost worked. The feeder was supposed to arrive at 11:52, and Route 17 was supposed to leave at 11:55. What the timetable did not show was the construction traffic that repeatedly consumed those minutes, or the human adjustments required to make the printed connection usable. Marcus supplied part of that adjustment from his recovery break. Evelyn supplied another part by running from the feeder, watching every clock, and gradually treating Marcus's waiting as something she owed him for. His 2-minute holds were acts of care. They were also invisible labor performed outside the system that was supposed to carry the responsibility. Because the arrangement remained private, Marcus received the late-running notices, while Evelyn developed the feeling that getting home depended on his personal willingness to risk them. The uncomfortable part is that neither of them intended to create that debt. It grew out of repeated small decisions that felt reasonable one night at a time. A printed schedule could count the minutes Marcus lost, but it could not count the obligation Evelyn began carrying because she knew exactly who had given those minutes to her. Evelyn's choice on the storm night can be read in two directions at once. She was trying to protect Marcus after hearing that another unauthorized hold could affect his assignment. She was also trying to protect Denise from losing the evening hours that helped keep the household budget together. In that sense, sitting in the all-night diner was an act of care. But the untouched coffee in front of her showed the other side of the choice. Evelyn had begun to believe that the cleanest solution was always the one in which she absorbed the discomfort herself and told no one. That did not remove the cost. It only made the cost private. When Denise gave up some premium hours, when co-workers began sharing pieces of childcare, and when Marcus filed the transfer problem through the transit system, the burden became more complicated rather than disappearing. Denise lost some income. Evelyn had to admit when helping was too much. Marcus had to accept that a documented complaint could move slowly while he still followed the current schedule. None of those choices was as simple as letting one person quietly sit in a diner until morning. They were simply costs that could finally be seen by the people being asked to carry them. The hardest part of Marcus's new boundary is that it can look worse in the moment than the old one. A driver who sees a familiar passenger hurrying toward the stop and closes the doors on schedule may appear less compassionate than the driver who waits. Marcus knew that feeling because he had lived on both sides of the door control. But if Route 17 could function safely only when Marcus personally surrendered his break and accepted the disciplinary risk, then Evelyn's ride home depended less on public service than on which employee happened to be behind the wheel. His unauthorized waits had helped her. They had also allowed the broken connection to remain partly hidden inside his own choices. Following the departure rule did not suddenly make the rule fair, and filing paperwork did not guarantee that service planning would fix the gap. The boundary remained uncomfortable because its purpose was not to produce a painless ending. It was to stop one person's private mercy from becoming another person's unspoken entitlement or debt. Marcus could still care whether Evelyn made it home. Evelyn could still appreciate what he had done. The difference was that neither of them would keep pretending that care required one of them to quietly carry a problem that belonged to more people than either had admitted.
Several weeks later, Marcus reached Maple Street at 11:55 on one of the evenings Evelyn no longer went to Denise's apartment. The weather was cold but clear. The pharmacy across the intersection was dark, and the covered shelter stood empty. Marcus looked toward the feeder route out of habit. Its headlights were not yet visible. For a moment, the empty bench pulled him back to the storm night, to the rain blowing through the shelter and the question of where Evelyn had gone. This time, there was nothing to solve. Evelyn was home because this was one of the nights Denise and she had already rearranged. The service gap request was still under review. Marcus's warning had not disappeared. Route 17 was still Route 17, and the departure time on the schedule had not changed. Marcus checked the mirror, closed the doors, and pulled away at 11:55. He reached the transit center with enough of his recovery period left to park, make the required walk around, and sit behind the wheel for a few quiet minutes before the final loop. His phone lit up beside the cold paper cup. Tessa had sent the same kind of message she used to send before their schedules began missing each other so often. "You on break?" Marcus looked at the departure clock. This time, there were still several minutes left. He picked up the phone and answered before Route 17 had to move again.